Physics XCP division. He earned a BA. Okay. He earned a BA in physics from Rice University in 1970 and a PhD in astronomy from the University of Wisconsin in 1974. His research interests currently include ion transport in plasmas and data science applied to laser-driven fusion experiments. He is a founding member and past president of the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum and is a member of the First United Methodist Church of Los Alamos. He enjoys exploring the ways that science and religion can work together to enhance our understanding of the universe as well as the reality that transcends the universe. He hopes that this talk tonight will help more people realize that although we live in an increasingly secular age, who we are and how we think has been profoundly shaped by religion. Okay, well, just a few simple logistics for our live stream presentation. We are recording this presentation tonight as we do every week. The video will be available on our website in a few days. You can modify your display name in the box with your image, and please let us know who you are. During the talk, we will mute all microphones to avoid background noise and interruptions. After the talk, the speaker will be taking questions via the Zoom chat. During the talk, you can type your questions into the Zoom chat. After the talk, we will relay the questions to Nels. Please limit your use of chat to everyone to questions just for the speaker. We will have time for some live questions, answers, and discussions after we address the questions in the chat. During the questions and answer period, you may use the raise hand feature next to your name in the participants panel. We'll try to watch that panel and give everyone a chance to ask a question. If you wish, you can download the slides for tonight's presentation from our website at any time. On the website, you can also add your comments about tonight's lecture. Okay, let's get going, and I'll turn this over to Nels, and we'll monitor the questions or comments coming in on chat. I hope you enjoy the talk. Now what do I do? Now I stop share. Okay, I have stopped share, and somehow,
okay, I will share my slide now.
Here, what? Oh, okay, yeah, get rid of this. Okay.
So
right.
Now we're going the other round, right? Thank you, Dan, for the introduction. My goal for tonight is to show you evidence that Christianity has profoundly affected the way you think. And this is true even if you are an atheist or non-Christian, assuming you are Western educated and have spent the amount of time around other Western educated people that most of us have. And this has happened through the influence of Christianity on your psychology and the psychology of Western Europe over many centuries. Now, when I say psychology, I'm not talking about Freudian dream interpretation. I'm talking about the ordinary topics of cognitive science. These are the cognitive abilities you have that you use to interpret day-to-day life. These are your perceptions, your assumptions, what you pay attention to, what motivates you, your heuristics, that is the rules of thumb by which you interpret the world around you and those interpretations. Furthermore, I want to show you evidence that Christianity thereby laid the foundation for the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution. The graphic shows a picture of Boniface presumably affecting the psychology of Northern Europeans around the year 720 as he chops down the holy oak of Odin or Jupiter somewhere in Germany. Now, the source I am primarily appealing to for this presentation is a book by Joseph Henrich, who is the chair of the Human Evolution Department at Harvard University. A recent book titled The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous, published in 2020. Now we're going to put a lot of emphasis on psychology in this talk of the kind I just described to you. And I mentioned my primary source, Henrich's book. So let's start with a psychological test. Who are you? If you're in a group of people who don't know you and you need to introduce yourself, you're likely to make maybe half a dozen statements or so, beginning perhaps I am, and you'll say something about yourself. So how do you answer this question? Who are you? Let me give you a few seconds to think about how you would answer this question. And I'm going to guess that you might answer the question along these lines. You might say, I am a teacher, a construction worker, a scientist, a mother, a Zoroastrian, a Bronco fan. You might say, I'm honest, I'm fearless, or I'm anxious and overworked. You might, however, answer along different lines. You might say something like this. I am the daughter of Nathan and Bree Atkins. I am the father of Pablo. I am the mother of Tyrone and Lakeisha Reynolds. I am Thorgrim, son of Asgrim, son of Housecold. So what's the difference in these ways of answering this question? Well, the first way of answering has to do with your description of your personal memberships, your abstract commitments, your attributes. The other way of answering the question has to do with your kin network relationships. You know, the first way of answering has to do with assigning yourself to some rather abstract categories. The second way of answering has to do with describing very concrete relationships with very concrete people. Now, if I had to guess, I would say that most of you probably answered with your personal memberships, attributes, or abstract commitments. And it probably didn't even occur to you to answer with your kin relationships. Although, of course, this would depend on exactly who the group of people was that you were in and having to introduce yourself to. And so, keeping that in mind, it's nevertheless true that in most societies today, that is, most different ethno-linguistic groups around the world, and probably throughout most of human history, people would answer and would have answered with their kin relationships, their kin network structure. And the fact that you didn't shows that you are weird, where weird is an acronym, and it stands for, it designates a way of thinking that is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And this is Joseph Henrich's term. It's the reason for the capital weird, weirdest people in the world in the title of his book. Now, if we look at some data around the world, looking at societies today, most societies, people answer the I am question with their kin relationships. So we look at the chart on the left that graphs as the solid dark bar, the fraction of people who answer with their with their concrete kin roles and relationships. The gray bar is the fraction of people who answer with their abstract attributes, abilities, and aspirations. You see that among United States undergraduates, the majority answer with their attributes, abilities, and aspirations. Undergraduates in Nairobi, Kenya, and Africa are quite similar to US undergraduates. But if we look at laborers in Nairobi or members of the Maasai or Samburu indigenous groups in Kenya, they answer overwhelmingly with their kin roles and relationships. Let's go halfway around the world here on the right-hand side to the South Pacific and compare Illinois undergraduates. This now, the solid bar shows only the fraction answering with their social relational relationships, and compare high schoolers in New Zealand or adults in New Zealand. Compare them to Cook Islanders, small island in the South Pacific, especially among rural villagers. They resemble the indigenous groups in Africa. And they probably haven't been conferring with those indigenous groups, at least for several tens of thousands of years. So this is showing us something quite deep-seated about the way humans think of themselves, think of their identities, and how it differs around the world. So you see that weird people, Westerners, really do not often answer with their kin network relationships. This test, by the way, measures a trait called individualism. Let's take another test. Which line on the right-hand side is the same length as the target? So here's the target line. Which of these lines on the right is the same length? Suppose you're in a group of people who are all being asked this question. Would your answer depend on the answers of other people in your testing group? Well, no, of course not. You'd give the right answer because you're interested in being right, even if it means not conforming. So here's the thing. These researchers administered these tests in small groups of people, maybe 3 or 4 people, but they have coached everyone in the group except you to give an incorrect answer occasionally. And then they've observed what you answered and how it correlated with the answers of other people in the group. Well, weird people over here on the left-hand side, and this test, by the way, measures something called conformity. They do not conform to the other members of the group very much. But if you go elsewhere on Earth, Fiji, Ghana, Hong Kong, Zimbabwe, there is a tendency of people more and more to answer the test in a way that does not disturb the harmony of the group. Why bother with some abstract notion called correctness if it would mean upsetting other people you are with? So once again, weird people are at one extreme end of this distribution, and other ethno-linguistic groups can be quite different from weird people in this sense. So weird people, and that's basically you and me, we're just different. Henrich points out that weird people are highly individualistic, self-obsessed, control-oriented, nonconformist, guilt-ridden, and analytical compared to other human societies. Now, you and I can probably think of people who are more extreme in this sense than other people are, and other of our friends and associates, let's say, who really don't exhibit these traits all that strongly. But let's be clear, this designation of weird behavior, of weird psychology, actually, applies to just about everybody in Western society to some degree, assuming you have been educated according to Western standards and norms and have lived in Western society for a sufficiently long period of time. Well, in 2010, Henrich and his co-workers pointed out that something was wrong with a lot of psychological research done to date. And they published this in a paper titled "The Weirdest People in the World" in the journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences in 2010. And so what Henrich pointed out is that behavioral scientists routinely publish broad claims about human psychology and behavior in the world's top journals, and they've drawn their samples entirely from Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies, weird societies. And they went on to say that members of weird societies, ironically, even the young children, are among the least representative populations one could find for making generalizations about humans. Well, as you can imagine, this publication upset a certain number of psychological researchers, and there was a lot of give and take and back and forth, continued publication for and against Henrich et al.'s point of view. And our job tonight is not to pursue that scientific literature. We can leave the psychologists themselves to work that out. But this article does raise some interesting questions that we will pursue, and which Henrich pursues, of course, in his book. One question is, were we always this way? Were weird Europeans always this way? And if not, was there a time when Europeans were more like the rest of humanity, psychologically speaking? And if so, when was that? And by the way, how did we get to be the way we are now? So this is what Henrich is going after in his research subsequent to 2010. And it's what is published then in this book I have been referring to. There's another question that's raised. How can we even hope to answer questions like those? We can't go back in time to perform psychological tests on ancient Europeans. So Henrich's method is to make the following assumption. We're going to assume that human psychology is encoded in human institutions. And by institutions, I don't mean the Supreme Court or First National Bank. I mean the customs and the norms by which humans ordinarily carry out their routine day-to-day existence in society, in the culture in which they happen to be embedded. So then the point is we can learn about past psychology by studying past institutions. So this is how Henrich proceeds. And what it means is that he has to assemble a great deal of psychological, anthropological, sociological, and historical scholarship to try to do this. So this is extremely cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary work. And you know, it's kind of unnatural for academics to do this kind of thing. There's a great deal of specialization in academia, as you may know if you've interacted extensively with academics. And so, and this is hard. However, all the interesting questions that remain are multidisciplinary. You know, the easy questions have been answered. And so we're left with these gnarly multidisciplinary questions. And Henrich, to his great credit, I would say, tackles this. So here's what he's saying. He's saying that the organism and the environment constantly influence each other over generations. Now, I like thinking about the beaver and the dam to make sense of this. This idea that there's a constant interaction with causality flowing in both directions between the organism and the environment is kind of a recent idea in evolutionary science. There's a very good description of it by Kevin Leyland in his book, Darwin's Unfinished Symphony, How Culture Made the Human Mind. If you are a neo-Darwinist, you are accustomed to thinking of the influence of the environment on the organism. The causality flows one way, from the environment to the organism. The environment selects for and produces organisms that have been selected for, leaving just the fittest, those organisms that can reproduce the most abundantly, dominant, and weeding out less fit organisms through this constant process of random mutation and natural selection. If the environment changes, well, too bad for the organism. The organism has got to adapt and will do so or else face extinction. But what is now known and has really, it's a field of evolutionary science that has blossomed in the last half of the 20th century and now in the 21st century. What's now apparent is that there is reciprocal causality, that organisms change their environments. And the beaver is a perfect example of that. The beaver changes its environment and does not live in just the natural environment. It makes its own environment. And then the environment, of course, does affect the beaver. That's why the beaver has a broad, flat tail, well adapted for swimming in a pond that the beaver made. So the beaver and the dam are a good representation of this kind of reciprocally causal, constant feedback between the organism and the environment. This is called gene culture coevolution or dual inheritance. And it is one of a number of concepts that are gathered under the rubric of the extended evolutionary synthesis, by which evolutionary biologists now understand that there's much more going on than what the neo-Darwinists would say is a one-way gene deterministic causality in which the organism is merely the hapless victim of the environment. It's much more elaborate than that, and the organism has much more influence than that one-way causality. So this is what Henrich is appealing to when he's saying that psychological changes influence what ideas and beliefs can emerge and spread. And then, of course, those ideas and beliefs are going to influence psychology reciprocally. So our social institutions influence our psychology and vice versa, but it's not a beaver and a dam, it's us and our institutions. So our psychology then are these cognitive processes, and our instincts for pair bonding or avoiding incest or for sharing food then are embedded in our institutions so that we have norms and patterns and practices and traditions for marriage and kinship and food sharing. Who do you share food with, and when do you share it? These are all parts of our traditions and our norms. Then our institutions then, of course, create environments in which we experience stress or security, praise or punishment during our childhood and adolescence. And that shapes our psychology, and then around and around in this continually feeding back loop of reciprocal causality between psychology and institutions. So this is what Henrich is going to appeal to. Now, by the way, before I dive a little more deeply into this, I just want to pause and point out that as we're looking for modern science, when we say modern science, we're referring to empirical mathematical science, as described by Francis Bacon and by Galileo. And you remember that weird people like to think in terms of abstract categories, feeding well into this empirical inductive approach to nature, and objective validity, irrespective of peer opinion. And so the mathematical nature of modern science fits very well with this emerging weird psychology. But I throw this slide in here just to remind you of where we're going. We're going to be looking for the foundation of modern science. So keep psychology of weird people in mind here. Okay, but now let's get back to this story of looking for European psychology about 1,500 years ago. So to make a long story, somewhat less long, but it's still going to be long, we'll look at Europe about the year 500 CE, 500 in the Common Era, that is 500 AD. Because we have enough information from ancient Europeans that stems from a variety of sources, early law codes, church documents and letters, travelers' reports, saints' biographies, the Nordic and German sagas that were written down by the earliest literate people in Northern Europe, analysis of ancient DNA, and kinship terminologies in ancient writings. From these sources, it appears that the broad kinship patterns in pre-Christian Europe looked much like the rest of the world. That is, Europe looked a lot like what's going on in other ethno-linguistic groups around the world today. But so it's evidence then that European psychology also resembled the psychology of the rest of the world back at that time, 500 AD, 1500 years ago. Here is a graphic depicting a scene in an Icelandic saga. It was written about 1200, but the events were taking place about 200 years earlier than that. And it's just, these sagas are wonderful sources of information about the way people lived back then. So this, of course, is not 500 AD, it's 1000, but we can get a glimpse of the way the world was back then. And this is the information that Henrich is going to appeal to then to look at institutions and thereby look at psychology. So what do we conclude from looking at the psychology of 500, the year 500? Well, life would have been different for you and me in a European tribe about 1500 years ago. Most European people lived in clans, tribes, or other kin groups. What is a clan or a tribe? Well, it is an association of people who are related to each other, for one thing. And a clan may trace its lineage through a very particular patriarch. Tribes, in a general sense, are a collection of clans who trace their lineage back to a forebear who may have semi-divine or divine status. So their family tree is quite large, and it may be difficult for one tribe member to say exactly how he's related to another tribe member, but they share practices and norms, and their languages are rather similar. In these groups, marriages were usually arranged. The patriarch might tell you who to marry, and it's generally a patriarch. The European kinship groups were generally patrilineal. They would trace their ancestry back through the father's 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 line. The patriarch would at least suggest who you ought to marry. That's what's going on in those Icelandic sagas. And possibly it should be a cousin. You should marry a cousin, because that just keeps your kinship ties strong within the clan. Generally, the bride would go to live with the husband's family. So that means that the father's father's sons are all living with their uncles and male cousins. The women have gone off to live with other clans. And this, of course, serves to strengthen the bonds between those clans, because they will have children then that they're all related to. Land is owned in common by the clan. That means you don't own any land yourself. You can't sell it without the consent of your relatives. And you depend on your kin group for security, to settle disputes, to avenge wrongs, perhaps to pay blood money in case of a wrong, of a murder committed by a clan member, and to maintain the norms by enforcing adherence to the norms. The clan or your clan or kinship group cares for the sick and the elderly, accepts this corporate responsibility in the case of disputes, and conducts the rituals to satisfy the gods and the ancestors. Polygynous marriages were common for high status men. To a certain extent, this would be politically expedient. If the chieftain of the clan can marry numerous wives, well, then that helps to create bonds with other clans, and that's a good thing. Around this time, 500 of the Common Era, the Roman Empire was receding, and Europe was being overrun by polytheistic northern tribes. I say polytheistic northerners to avoid saying pagan barbarians, but writers around that time, and even as late as Edward Gibbon in his History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, would refer to these as pagan barbarians. Well, I'll avoid that somewhat judgmental term to a certain extent. Clovis, king of the Franks, conquered most of what is now France. Here is an illustration. This is a recent illustration. This does not date back to the 5th century, of course, but shows Frankish warriors of the 5th century. Clovis himself was raised a pagan and was baptized, became a Christian, but in the words of one history podcaster, Clovis pretty much remained a thug with an axe all his life. The Saxons under Hengist moved into Britain. There's some debate about whether this constituted an invasion of Britain, but one way or another, the Saxons, who were pagans, displaced the Christians in most of Britain, except Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland. And these polytheistic northerners brought their customs with them that replaced Roman justice, especially under the Franks. So murder was punished by a fine, and that fine was larger depending on the noble status of the murder victim. Judicial duels replaced legal process. If you have a complaint with somebody, rather than file suit in court, you just strap on your swords and grab your shields and go at it with each other. If you are not a good fighter, you have to hire a mercenary to do your fighting for you. Slavery was revived and extended. Why was there slavery? Well, it's because there was a lot of warfare. And when warfare leads to the capture of non-combatants, well, you could slaughter all those prisoners, but it makes much more sense to sell them into slavery. That way they get to live and you get money. So slavery started to make a comeback. Gibbon quotes contemporary commentator saying there was a general contempt for the rule of law at this time, and that probably is a reference to the replacement of Roman justice by these Frankish or Northern European customs. Europe was poor, populated by illiterates, and we'll see this again. During this time, Gibbon says that the Goths, who had conquered the Ukraine about the year 250, that's a little earlier than 500, but he says the Goths still adhered to a life of idleness, of poverty, and of rapine. If you wonder what rapine is, that is where if you have something and I want it and I think I can take it, I will go take it from you. And that characterized the Goths, in fact, these Northern Europeans in general. Tacitus, in writing in the Germania, describing these tribes back around the year 100, says their way of thinking was that it seems limp and slack to get with the sweating of your brow what you can gain with the shedding of your blood. So why work for it when you can just go take it? This was part of that Northern European ethic. What was going on in the rest of the world at this time? Well, in the year 750, China and the Islamic world were far wealthier and more dynamic than Europe, more culturally dynamic than Europe. In China, the emperors of the Tang dynasty ruled a territory inhabited by 60 to 80 million people. The capital, Chang'an, was the most populous city on earth, more than 1 million inhabitants, and it was laid out on a regular geometric grid. Very modern kind of development. There are many inventions that came out of Tang China. Gunpowder, porcelain china, the stuff that we call China today, that the porcelain crockery that we use, that was invented during the Tang dynasty. Woodblock printing, this wonderful armillary sphere. Here's a diagram of the armillary sphere of Yixing, who was a Buddhist monk and astronomer, mathematician, and mechanical engineer. Here is a human figure right here. You see how big this thing is. It's turned by water, a series of gears here, then turn. The armillary sphere is a model of the heavens. It's a model of all the planets' motion. And so this was built back there in the 8th century. Of course, it was built for astrological purposes, and there was only one of them. And you can guess who owned it, because to do astrology in those days was to predict the future. And so the emperor owned this armillary sphere, the only one. And Of course, if you could predict the future using this armillary sphere, that would tell you the fate of the emperor. And so this was like nuclear secrets. There could only be one, and it was owned by the emperor. The Islamic empire had spread across several continents by the year 750, and the Islamic caliphs were very interested in the wisdom of all the nations they were conquering. So the House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah, was established in Baghdad by the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. This is the caliph that we know from the stories of the Arabian Nights, 1001 Arabian Nights. The House of Wisdom was probably the greatest repository of books in the world by the year 850 and contained texts coming from many nations, Greek, Persian, and Indian texts, covering wide ranges of human knowledge. There was at this time an emphasis on empiricism and actually carrying out experiments, optical experiments primarily by Al-Haytham, European version of his name, Alhazen, who did experiments with lenses, mirrors, refraction, and reflection. So you see how busy the rest of the world was, but Europe just didn't amount to much. Even by the year 1000, Europe was one of the world's more stagnant regions. And this is in the assessment of Professor Philip Dayleader, as he puts it in his course, The High Middle Ages, available from the Great Courses. He says Europe was economically undeveloped, intellectually derivative, and geopolitically passive, meaning that it was poor. All of its learning was derivative. It came from someplace else. Nothing novel was going on in Europe. And it was geopolitically passive, meaning it really wasn't interacting to much of an extent with the rest of the world. Illiteracy, starvation, and disease were the norm. And this is in stark contrast then to the world of Islam, classical India, which had monumental architecture and important philosophical and mathematical developments. And then, of course, Tang China, as I've just outlined. Well, we can't leave Europe at this point. Things are looking bad for Europe, and in fact, you would have to say that an objective observer would not expect much out of Europe at this point. Why would Europe be the location for cultural developments that would lead to world domination, frankly, in the next millennium, by the middle of the second millennium? How could that even happen? Well, we're going to start looking at this now briefly. We'll just get started because our time is almost up and we've got a long way to go yet. But here are some important developments. Early on, Charlemagne decided to do something about illiteracy. Who was Charlemagne? Well, he was king of the Franks after the year 768. And he became emperor of the Romans. He actually went to Rome and was crowned by the Pope emperor of the Romans in the year 800, and he died in 814. But he created what's called the Carolingian Empire by unifying much of Western and Central Europe militarily under his rule. And the Carolingian Empire then persisted through much of the 9th century. But he had a problem because there was a lack of literate people that he could use as court scribes. Basically, he needed people to write down what was happening in his empire. And so he ordered the creation of what were called cathedral schools. These were schools run by the clerics and the monks associated with cathedrals. And he brought scholars from all over the Christian world to his court in what is now Germany. One of their goals was to create a standardized curriculum for these new schools. And this curriculum was based on the old Roman curriculum of the 7 liberal arts. They were divided into what's called the trivium, rhetoric, logic, and grammar, and the quadrivium, which was the higher learning of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. when we say something is trivial, we mean it's covered in the trivium. It's simple. Now, Charlemagne loved books and learning, apparently, but it isn't clear that he himself could read or write. He liked being read to, and he would have the learned people in his court read to him. He apparently enjoyed the writings of Augustine in particular. So illiteracy started to diminish a bit under Charlemagne's rule. During this time, Irish monks in particular began spreading out over Europe, taking literacy with them. Why Irish monks? Well, this story is described very nicely in Thomas Cahill's book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. If you haven't read it, it's really an entertaining read. And he describes how Ireland was, kind of spared the invasion of these barbaric northerners during that first millennium. It was so remote that Christianity persisted in Ireland. The Ireland had been Christianized, of course, under who else? Patrick, in about the 4th century or so. And the Irish monks copied the Latin writings available to them because of that Christianization process. And they maintained literacy in good fashion out there in Ireland during this first millennium. And so then they spread out over Europe, thanks to Charlemagne to a great extent. Many European towns today that we know of today were founded by or linked to Irish monks. Many Catholic dioceses in Europe have an Irish monk as their patron saint. In fact, Christianity and learning were almost synonymous during the Middle Ages. Literacy arrived with Christianity in many regions of Europe. The northern tribes were not literate. They had no reason to resort to reading and writing. It wouldn't have done them any good. They had priests, of course, druids, who did have a lot of secret knowledge, but that's the point. It was secret. And when you write something down, it's too easy to lose control of it, and then other people may learn your secrets. Now, the priests did have a form of writing. We call it runes, runic writing, and there are a few examples of Viking runes, but there is not much literature at all, just a few cryptic inscriptions. So literacy really means almost the same thing as Christianity. And who was it who wrote down those old Norse and Icelandic sagas? Well, it was early Christians, and they were writing down the orally transmitted stories of earlier generations. Christianity also produced religious and cultural unity within Europe in the midst of political fragmentation. When the Carolingian Empire ended in the year 888, it fragmented into many, many little political entities, but there was still this religious and cultural unity in the sense that the Latin language gave a way for educated people, at least, to converse with each other, even though they came from different regions of Europe. And we'll see that this was important going on. I'll touch on this in my next talk next week to a greater extent. The church and state were separate entities. It's all too easy for the state to co-opt the religious organization and use it to carry out its bidding. And we see this again and again around the world when the rulers and the religious leaders get too close with each other, it's bad for the people. But, and this, frankly, it happens in Europe as well, of course. When the church and the state get too closely aligned, it may not be a good thing. But to a great extent, the story of Europe is the story of the church and the state fighting with each other, fighting for control of who gets to choose the emperor, for example. But when the church and state are separate, then if a scholar gets in trouble for thinking thoughts that are not viewed with approval by one or other authority, well, that scholar can go off someplace else and take refuge. Then, of course, the church was a patron and founder of schools and universities, and we'll see that this is important. Here's another important trend associated with Judeo-Christianity, which is the concept of the LIBER NATURAE, the book of nature. The idea is, and this is expressed by biblical writers long ago, the idea is that we can know God or know something about God through nature itself, God's creation. Psalm 19 says that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. So we look at nature, we can learn something about God. Augustine says this very explicitly. We can consider the whole of creation regarding God as its author by reading, so to speak, in the great book of nature, the Liber Naturae. Hugh of St. Victor, several centuries later, in the 11th, 12th centuries, says that the whole of this sensible world is like a book written by the finger of God. And the individual creatures are like symbols or letters in that book. And they are not invented in an arbitrary way by man, but ordained according to the will of God. So God can be revealed in nature according to this idea. And think about this too, that Christianity provides a philosophical basis for a scientific worldview. Not just Christianity, but this is Judeo-Christianity. This is Jewish thought. Philosophically, God is a trustworthy creator of a lawful cosmos. The universe is God's creation, and it is therefore good. And Scripture tells us explicitly that creation is good. We read this in Genesis chapter 1. This means that knowledge of the physical world is real knowledge, not delusion. Where Plato basically says that what we think of as reality is nothing more than the flickering shadows of reality, shadows cast on the back wall of a cave of the real objects passing by the mouth of the cave. But that's not the Judeo-Christian point of view. The Gnostic point of view, the Gnostics, basically a Greek-derived way of thinking, viewed the physical world as the product of an evil sub-god, not the God of the universe, but some kind of demiurge who created the world and all its evil, all the suffering and bad stuff in the world. Well, this is not the Judeo-Christian view, which is that creation is good. So therefore, we should expect regularities, patterns, order, and law in creation because God is faithful and consistent. Reason is a valid tool for knowing God, but that said, human logic is limited, so you can't understand creation just by thinking about it, Greek style. You have to observe it. Finally, since we are created in God's image, we can expect ultimately that the universe should be intelligible, that we can understand it. So next week, now we're coming to the end of my talk tonight. Next week, we're going to look at how Europe emerged from its underdeveloped state in the year 1000. I've outlined some of the ways that Christianity is going to play an important role in that development and in the development of science in particular. But Henrich's point is that the church was having an even more profound effect, or let's just call it at least an additional effect, and a profound one at that, on the psychology of all Europeans. So we're going to look next week at how the culture of Europe started to change, at the unique role of the church in fostering those changes, and we'll see why Henrich focuses particularly on the church's rules about marriage. It's what Henrich calls the Marriage and Family Program, or the MFP of the church, starting around the year 500. Henrich will walk us through how the MFP destroyed the ancient kinship structures of Europe, the clans and the tribes. He'll show us that it took centuries for the MFP to take this effect, and we'll look at when the weird psychology actually started to appear. We'll look at what was necessary for modern science to emerge. And I have to apologize and say that I am not really going to track all the events of the scientific revolution that take us to modern science. That would just take yet another talk, a third talk, and I am not going to do that. But I'm going to stress the foundation for modern science. That's why I've titled my talk, The Foundation of Modern Science, not necessarily the scientific revolution and the emergence of modern science itself. That's a bit of a caveat and a hedge here, but we are going to look at the changes in Europe that made modern science possible. And we'll talk briefly about why modern science did not arise in the Islamic world or China, even though tremendous intellectual accomplishments were produced in those parts of the world. And then we will briefly look at the downside. There is an unhappy legacy of weird cultures, encounters with other cultures. And within weird culture itself, there is the phenomenon of civilization and its discontents, sort of psychological, perhaps spiritual unrest within weird culture. So I hope you will join us next week for my concluding presentation, which is part 2 on how Christianity laid the foundation for modern science, the work of the church, what the church did in laying this foundation. But this concludes my presentation for tonight, and I want to leave you with a couple of questions for discussion. In case we have breakout rooms, I'm not sure if we're going to have breakout rooms or just continue in a single group for questions and answers. A couple of questions here. Does it make sense to you that people's psychology affects and is affected by their social structures, such as families, marriage customs, religious practices, and social learning behavior? Can you think of examples where there is an effect, there is this feedback, you know, the beaver and the dam kind of thing, where our psychology affects our customs and vice versa? A second question is literacy really important? How important is literacy to you, reading and writing? In what kinds of societies is reading and writing important or not important? When and where and why is literacy important? What would cause a change in the importance of literacy? When would it suddenly become important to you to begin reading and writing? So let's perhaps think about some of these questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, or at least end my slideshow, if possible. Maybe I can leave these questions here if that's a convenient way to see them. And Dan, I will.
Yes, okay, and yes, well, Nels, thank you for that great talk. I mean, and these nice questions here at the end to consider. Now that the talk is over, the first thing we do is we look at the questions in the chat. And Nels, you decided that you were going to do that. You were going to be the chat host, and you were going to, you're going to read out the question and then answer it.
Yeah,
okay?
I will take a look at that.
Okay. I mean, right
I
now,
think I'm going to have to stop sharing in order to do so.
right.
So.
Yes, we have 6 questions there in the chat. I don't know, can you see the questions?
Okay, I see a question here from Ken Grimm. He says, Nels, wonderful European history lesson. Thanks. Thank you, Ken. Would you say that the Christian Reformation, 1492, accelerated or retarded the development of Western civilization? Okay, I would put a date of 1515 on that, I think, Ken. But that's a detail. It's certainly the early 16th century there. Yeah, the Reformation, I will touch briefly on next week. Yes, it demonstrated that a new kind of religion was possible, and that novelty was a feature of many other developments here in the 16th century. There was a new world discovered in 1492. That's the date, 1492. So a novel world. You have a novel world, you have a novel religion, you have Tycho discovered a supernova in 1572, so a new star. And there's a long list of new things that happened, and I would say the Reformation is one of those. The Reformation also produced a widespread, let's call it an explosion of literacy, because it suddenly became extremely important for the average person to learn to read and write, so he and she could read scripture. So yes, literacy was expanded by the Reformation.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a comment here from Catherine Bartholdi. In Homer's Iliad, families and friendships are the reason for continuing the war, along with the gods' interest in controlling humans. Thank you, Catherine. That's an interesting concept. It makes the point, I guess, you're saying that families, that is, these kinship relationships, produce necessity for war. Friendships are other social relationships. So our in-group, the people we consider us as opposed to them, are a powerful reason for warfare. And that, of course, is almost a constant of human cultural history. We tend to have wars against them. It's us going to war against them. The idea that the gods are interested in controlling humans is important. You know, there are people who are more familiar with the history of religion and the diversity of religious beliefs and practices than I am here tonight. But I think the God's interest in controlling humans reminds me of the nobility's interest in controlling the behavior of the masses, let's call it. And I think in some religions we see the gods basically just behaving like royalty, you know. And so, yes, everybody's interested in controlling the behavior of other people. And if religion gives us a way to do it, you know, we're all too quick to take the bait. Charles Keller writes, though Christianity, that the book of nature was real and reflected its creator, was this too also how Greek and Islamic scientists saw it? You know, it's a good question. I think we can say that Greek scientists, Greek philosophers did not see the world that way. I pointed out how Plato saw reality as a delusion. Reality is no good. You know, in the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, the author points out how profoundly pessimistic Greek thought was. That was his word. And I think there is this hopeful attitude in Judeo-Christianity that is not found in Greek thought. And so perhaps this relates to this notion that reality is kind of, if not outright evil, then at least illusory. Islam probably has a more optimistic view about reality, but about creation, but that would require an Islamic expert to comment on more. As for Islam, didn't the Mongols suppress science? Okay, you're leaping ahead, Chick, to next week's talk, which you have seen a dry run for, so no fair. Both China and Islam were quite literate, but somehow this didn't cause them to adopt modern science. Again, this is not just next week's talk, Chick. This would be a third talk that I haven't put together yet. Yes, why didn't China and Islam get to modern science? Very important question. I will say a bit more about that next week.
This is Victoria Earhart. I have a response to that question if you want one.
Okay, yeah, please, yeah, jump in here. This should be a discussion time.
Okay. I don't know much about medieval China, but I know considerably much more about Islam. There are three things that happened that moved the West into what we call the modern world. The scientific revolution, the revolutions in America and France, and the Industrial Revolution. So the scientific revolution, where we have the invention of instruments that expand our data set. We have telescopes and microscopes. So we're no longer dependent just on our eyes. The political revolutions in the colonies and France, with the rise of this idea of a accountable, elected, secular government. And then the Industrial Revolution, as an offshoot of the scientific revolution. Those three things didn't happen in the Islamic world. The Islamic world came into modernity without those three essential markers of what makes the modern Western world, beginning in the 1700s, if you will. Okay? The Islamic world didn't have any of those, and it's still trying to catch up.
Yeah, thank you.
So modern science from 1700 took off in the West because I think we had those three factors that allowed for it, and neither China nor Islam did. And so they stayed in what I would consider a medieval pattern for centuries beyond what the West did.
Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, and what I'll do in my talk next week is show you the roots or the seeds that permitted those three revolutions to occur in Europe, in fact. So yeah, so we'll get to that. I don't want to curtail the discussion tonight, but of course, these are huge topics, and a huge amount of scholarship and research has been expended. As Henrich says, a great deal of ink has been spilled on these topics. And so what I hope, Chick, I know you wrote me an email today asking me about this, and I'm sorry that I haven't responded to you. What I want to do is send you a list of books that cover these topics, and I will include some of them in my references for next week's talk. Yeah, this whole phenomenon is sometimes referred to as the Great Divergence. Why did Europe diverge from the history of the rest of the world? How did that happen? So you can Google the Great Divergence. You can Google the Needham question, Needham. Joseph Needham was a biologist in England during the 1930s who became fascinated by China and spent a lot of time in China digging up the history of science in China. And he wrote a volume on why China did not have a scientific revolution. Anyway, this can go on and on and on. But I encourage you all to do your own explorations, and I will come back to it next week. Victoria Earhart writes, can you provide more evidence for the separation of church and state prior to the Reformation, which did provide the basis for separating the two? There is a great book by Tom Holland called The Forge of Christendom, and it's about the events in Europe during the 11th century, so 1000 to 1099. And what's going on during that time is a big struggle between the church and the state, between the Pope and the rulers about who got to decide who the next emperor was and who got to decide who the next Pope was. You had emperors claiming it was their right to choose the Pope, and you had popes claiming it was their right to choose the emperor. So this is told in, with great zest in The Forge of Christendom. So this tug of war between church and state is very apparent during the 11th century. But
well, I don't know. Got the Crusades in there. That was certainly an amalgamation of church and state. The Pope calls for a crusade, and all the dukes and princes have to go along with it or get excommunicated. I don't see the big separation yet.
Well, it ebbs and flows, doesn't it?
Okay. Yeah, it does, depending on the power of the Pope.
I mean, next week, right. Next week, I'm going to show you a chart of the edicts coming out of the church about marriage practices and cousin marriage, and why you have to stop marrying your cousins, you know. And sometimes the kings would line up with this. Some kings were just great with that, and they would say, yeah, you do what the church says, or else we're going to take your property away and divide it up among your family. You know, but other times the kings just kind of ignored it. And let's face it, the nobility of Europe went right on marrying their cousins right up to the 20th century. Okay, so yeah, it comes and goes, you know, it ebbs and flows. Yeah, the Crusades are a great example of the Pope saying, all you nobles got to get out of Europe. Take your war and just get out of Europe. Go someplace else. Go over to the Middle East. You know, capture the Holy Land. That was great for Europe. Getting all those violent nobles out of Europe was a great thing. So yeah, fortunately, sometimes the state would do what the church said, but not always. So yeah, it's, you know, comes and goes.
Did Professor Henrich mention the effect of the Black Death in Europe as distinct from its effects in China or the Islamic world?
He did spend a little time on it. He compared it to World War I, but in fact, it was way, way worse than World War I.
Oh.
I will talk about that briefly next week. You know, I hate to put this barricade at the year, you know, 1200 or 1000. 1000 is basically when I stopped my talk tonight. Of course, there's way more that's going to happen now in the next 1,000 years, but I'm going to get to some of it next week. So I guess I'll just leave it at that for right now.
Nels, you have a question from Gary in the chat.
Yes, I see that. Thank you. Gary Stradling asks, Nels, you attribute the changes in Europe to the Christian religion. Can you point to specific Christian theology that underpins that? Or was it just a coherent policy organization that did it? You know, Gary, as I'll get to next week, it wasn't even a coherent policy organization. There were a lot, it was kind of a continuing series of edicts that sort of were perhaps motivated by Leviticus 18. The Levitical law includes prohibitions against incest of one kind and another. And there was also Roman custom. The Romans prohibited various kinds of incest. And in fact, all cultures, you know, have various rules about who you can and can't marry. One thing Henrich does not do, and it's something I had hoped to address, but frankly run out of time and space even in 2 talks, is to look at the wider message of Christianity, the entire cultural package of Christianity, which, as you obviously know, and many of you know, is much more than just a set of rules about marriage. Henrich sort of treats the influence of Christianity as simply the result of rules about marriage. And in fact, Henrich avoids talking about Christianity in the large sense and just talks about the church, the Western church, or just the church. That's what Henrich talks about. And I have wanted to expand what Henrich is looking at beyond just the church's rules about marriage. But that would be a very, very large topic. I would say one thing, though, is that the church's rules about wealth and who you can and should give your money to must have had some effect on European psychology. Rich people in Rome didn't feel any particular compulsion to give money to the poor. What they gave their money to was the city of Rome and the citizens of Rome. It was the citizens that mattered, not the poor. Today, as a result of Christianity, we are probably inclined to regard the poor as more deserving of our charity than the citizens of our town or nation. But in Rome, it was the citizens, it was the people of Rome who were worthy of being the recipient of your beneficence. And the church changed that. The church went to work real hard to change that. Not the citizens, it's the poor that you need to give to. And by the way, the church will take care of that for you. So the church then was the recipient of a lot of that.
When I speak later in the series, I will touch on that a little bit, because the doctrinal content of Christianity, I believe, had a huge impact also on the stabilization and development of civilization. things like marriage, honesty, laws against violence, all of those things that that our Norse ancestors didn't give a lot of credence to.
That's right. Yeah. Now, this is what I'm going to get to next week, because this will be part of the changing psychology of Europe. You know, you see the homicide rate start to really decline. I didn't put this in my talk, and it was not in my dry run, but the homicide rate falls off as social institutions start to work better as a means of resolving disputes. And when the homicide rate falls off and you start to trust your courts and judges, well, that's going to change your psychology, isn't it? So yeah, you know, I think the church is teaching about loving your enemy and forgiving your friend, you know, or forgiving everyone 70 times 7 times. Those kind of teachings must have an effect in the context of a declining homicide rate, that, yeah, maybe I can afford to forgive that guy who did the bad stuff, because I'm going to nail him in court, you know. I don't know. But yeah, well, yep, there have to be more effects than just the marriage rules, I think.
All right.
Okay, that seems.
That's the end of the chat questions. If there's anybody else out there have a question, you know, you could raise your hand. Can we see everybody? Or I don't know, how many people can we see? Do we see anybody has a question? I don't see anybody has a question.
If you have a question and he doesn't see you, just speak out.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Chick. Thank
Yeah, we
you.
can just talk now.
Okay.
You can unmute, you can unmute yourself.
You can unmute yourself. Oh, okay, good. All right, look, I think that's it, Nels. I don't see any other questions.
I hope you'll all join us again next week.
Yes, join us again next week. Thank you.
Somebody has a hand raised. I just saw. Or maybe he was waving goodbye.
We're all going to give you a round of applause, I think.
Can I just make
Oh, wait,
one?
Vicky has one thing. Yeah, sure.
Just one brief observation. We talk about reading and writing as though that's the same thing. Because when I went to school, we learned our ABCs and we learned to read and we learned to write at the same time, right?
Mhm.
Okay, that's a fairly modern invention. I didn't realize that, and I didn't appreciate it, that a person, say Emperor Justinian, he could read, but reading was taught separately from writing. So you could be a fairly literate person in terms of your ability to read the documents you needed, even though you could barely write more than your name. So we have a lot of people. Yeah, I did not appreciate this at all, that if someone is incapable of writing, that doesn't mean they're illiterate in the pre-modern sense. They could read, but they had no means to write, and paper was very expensive, or whatever, even with the printing press. So people learn to read at a basic functional level, but writing at more than a basic functional level in any kind of widespread sense was much, much later.
That's
I
interesting.
didn't know that.
Really are different skills. I mean, you know, writing requires these fine motor skills that it's hard for a lot of people.
And people didn't have, most people didn't have occasion to write, so they didn't bother learning it.
Yeah.
Nels, we have a hand raised from Kathy Walters.
Okay.
It was actually an applause sign. Sorry.
Oh.
Oh, okay.
Oh, much better. Okay.
I would just like to say that I don't know if Nels is a very, very clever person, but what he has done is give a talk that makes us all, gets our juices running, and makes us all think about, you know, whether it's right or not and what's going on. And and he keeps saying, excuse me, he keeps saying, well, next week you'll have all the answers. So I bet you we have a large listenership next week. Way to go, Nels.
Well, thanks, Chick. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's a huge story. You know, And even in 2 talks, I'm not going to be able to do justice to what Henrich puts in his book. Like, I've left out a whole lot of anthropology that's in Henrich's book, and his discussions of what happens around the world and other cultures around the world today. That's pretty important to a story, but I had to leave it out. But anyway, thank you. And yeah, come back next week.
Very good. All right.
Good
6:30.
talk. Good talk.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Good. Good night.